Welcome to Dekom, Law and Disorder.
The views expressed on this podcast are Peter Dekom's opinions based on his legal experience, research, and academic work. The podcast does not offer legal advice. For any legal matters, always consult an independent attorney who can assess your specific situation. And now, on with the show.
Hi, everybody. It's Peter Dekom again, ready for another fun podcast. We're going to talk about China today and its relationship to our economy and the world reconfiguration, according to Donald. I'm going to go back and do a little Chinese history, modern Chinese history. I'm not going back to the Shang period or the Dukes of Chu or all the other cool stuff that I've studied. I've spent a lot of time studying about China. I've been there many times. I've been to Hong Kong, China, and or Macau 15 times. It fascinates me and it terrifies me. I went to China about a decade ago to make a very large deal with a large lending organization, governmental, made the deal. It was basically the combined economics of it all was $500 million. And the net impact is that the government reneged. So for those of you who are looking to make deals in China, and it's the largest non-US economy on the planet, be careful. Understand one of the things that I find with people from the United States is they assume the same legal system, customs, and practices that we enjoy here are equally applicable there. No, they're not. But knowing a little bit about China, which is absolutely essential, is what today is all about. And part of the reason I'm looking at this is because we used to be the Western alliances versus the autocratic communist or former communist governments or pseudo-communist governments. And so I'm going to realize that we're actually not in either. The autocratic world is one place, and the Western democracies are another place, and we seem to be drifting off somewhere into the middle. And that's very troubling to me, but I kind of want to understand what we're doing to ourselves and how this impacts. In my recent discussion of the Federal Reserve, I noticed that basically to the extent that other people have to buy treasuries in order to support our deficits, we are more at the mercy of the world than anyone believes, and we need to know that. So what we do vis-a-vis the rest of the world becomes extremely important for us in dealing with the world. So I think I want to start off today by discussing modern China. After the long march after World War II, by the way, during World War II, the right-wing Kuomintang, which wound up moving to Taiwan, and the Chinese Communist Party actually got together to fight the Japanese. But that wasn't a comfortable world. And after World War II, Mao Zedong began a long march, which culminated in 1949 in entering the Forbidden City and taking China. Meanwhile, the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek was in Taiwan, and they claimed, we're China. Mao Zedong claimed, no, I'm China, and you, Taiwan, like it or not, you're really part of me. I run everything. Historically, understand, there is no history of a unified government absolutely exercising control over Taiwan. That's a recent fabrication. Sure, if you look at Greater China, you can kind of make that argument. It's an island there, but it grew up completely separately. It's kind of like if the Native Americans decided they wanted to take the United States back, we have no control over those areas in the United States, do we? Well, unfortunately, notwithstanding all the sadness that went into it, we do. So let's talk more about where China went under Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was a classic communist. And if you remember, communism is forced socialism where the government owns everything, and it is run by a correct thinking elite. And if you're not a correct thinker, there is a police force of one form or another that will call what you're doing woke. Will basically say that what you're doing is not consistent with the best interest of the state. And the state secret police, state secret police will come and take you away and put you in prison for a long time. By the way, the legal system pretty much says that if we bust you, you're going to get convicted. So don't worry about it. The state in China, you go through the court system, but the Politburo, the governing body of the Communist Party, has complete and total veto power over what courts decide. So the judicial system, the legislative system, and the executive are all one under the Communist Party. Now, a lot of times you've had people who, like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin and others, who've worked through the party system to govern the country. The term of office after Mao Zedong was 10 years. We now have a situation where, starting in 2012, we have a new leader, Xi Jinping, who sort of passed and changed the rules and now does not have term limits. Where does that look familiar? Okay, so we have a very strange period during Mao where he tried to make China great again. In 1963, he instituted a policy called the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was to take the individual members, the basic peasants, the proletariat, to basically make them become the bulwark of the Chinese economy. Mao had a very strange vision of how it all worked, but in 1963, this Great Leap Forward program was basically correct thinking, also to erase a moment where Mao Zedong basically said, let 1,000 flowers bloom, express your opinion. People took notes, so when the Great Leap Forward stepped in, those people who expressed their opinions were dealt with accordingly. That's free speech when it's not. Mao had a lot of bad habits. He loved young girls, 12 to 14-year-olds. He was legendarily famous for having them come to service his carnal needs. He didn't believe in Asian medicine and had a medical doctor educated in Australia, Dr. Li, L.I., who basically wrote a book about Mao, a very interesting book, and he basically treated him for all kinds of stuff. Effectively, a lot of that treatment was, oh, here, have a pill. Oh, here, have another one. Here, oh, have several. So by the time Mao Zedong died, he was a total stoner. And, basically we substitute being stoned as a president for being demented as a president. Either way, it doesn't help you lead the country. Well, Mao Zedong had a lot of things that what he did during that Great Leap Forward is very, very important. He said, okay, I want people to build smelters to do steel in their backyard. Take your pots and pans, take your metal bed frames, melt them down and create products that are good for the state. Oh, that's a great idea. You can get high quality steel out of a home backyard smelter. It was a disaster. The steel that came out of that was just unusable. And unfortunately for the people who melted their pots and pans and their bed frames, they had a very uncomfortable quality of life. Mao also had another problem. He did not like airplanes. Apparently, he executed people by having their planes crash. So one of the things he liked to do was take the train anywhere he went. He didn't like get in a plane. So he wanted to go visit Khrushchev in Russia, and he took a train. And because he had a policy, agricultural policy, which was based on the writings and teachings of a Russian agronomist named Lyshenko, that if you use communist philosophy, the way to grow strong crops is to dig ditches, put the seeds and the little plants in those deep, dark holes, and they will struggle like a communist, good communist, to grow, be good and strong. He really believed it. And so as this train was destined to go through China and up into Moscow, his cadres built giant wooden platforms by the trains and put crops all over those platforms. So when his train went through it, it looked like, wow, we're really growing stuff. But they were all fake crops. As a matter of fact, one of the things that happened in the local administrators of various districts were basically told, you have to give a third of your growth to Beijing, and it will be dealt with as a central repository of grain. So in order to impress the bosses in Beijing, a lot of these original administrators basically said, well, I'm going to grow X. And X was always huge, much more than they could ever grow. But in order to vindicate Mao Zedong's belief in Lyshenko, they basically said, here's how much product we're going to do. So Beijing said, fine, here's how much you have to send for your third. But that third tended to wind up being more like 50, 60% of the products. So there's a lot of starvation, a lot of horrible stuff going on. And by 1966, the Russian Politburo had it with Mao Zedong. He was relegated to a little place where he could have his 12-year-olds. They didn't care, the Chinese tradition, and he could basically eat well, have a good life, but he would no longer have any political power. That did not make Mao Zedong happy. So he knew that the leaders of the Communist Party were no longer his buddies. How do you get rid of them and put yourself back in power? Very clever. What he did is he pulled the country down. He recruited students and young people to destroy the immediate hierarchy above them, and the hierarchy kept going up until you pulled down the whole damn nation. That was the great cultural revolution. A lot of people have heard the words. They don't know what it meant. And he basically recruited people to destroy his country and pull it down. They were the people at the bottom that were basically saw a deep state, and they pulled it down. And the net impact was a collapse of the Chinese government, the Chinese economy, and it became a militaristic reality, and nobody was particularly happy. Anybody who had the slightest amount of political clout was sent somewhere else. Deng Xiaoping was banished to be down with a bunch of old generals and stuff. He was a rising star, and Mao didn't like that. So Mao is getting sicker, the drugs are getting heavier, and the Cultural Revolution is a wild failure. Mao basically got visited by a guy named Richard Milhous Nixon in 1971 to open China. Everyone is a little optimistic, but Mao is a stoner and not in any way, shape, or form able to implement and sustain a long-term policy with the United States. At least Richard Nixon tried. And it was quite an interesting reality for a while. Anyway, by 1976, Mao died. Now what? When Mao had left his legacy to a guy named Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng was, someone once asked, so what do you stand for? Who are you? And Hua Guofeng, I am for whatever Mao would do. So he got the little name of the whatever chairman, and nobody treated him seriously. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping woke up and said, you know what? I think it's time for me to go to Beijing, and I'm going to get my generals and military and People's Liberation Army. By the way, whenever you see the PLA or People's Liberation Army, that's all the military branches combined. So I'm going to go and FYI, the PLA is not a branch of government. It is a branch of the Communist Party. Most people don't know that, but it's a pretty strange reality. So anyway, Deng Xiaoping heads over to Beijing and goes to Hua Guofeng, and he says, see all that military stuff out there? They're my people. So I'm going to make a deal with you. You're going to resign, and I'm going to ascend to take your job. And you're going to be the one to endorse me. So that happened. Deng Xiaoping became head of China in 1981. And he realized that the entire economic structure of China was decimated by old world communism and Maoism. So he basically said the following, which I find to be one of the most interesting statements in modern Chinese history. He said, Mao was a great father of the country. We needed him. He needed him to consolidate China and bring it together. But his economic vision didn't quite work for all of us, so we're going to have a new one. And it's basically where you can work, you can have a business, you can earn money, you can do all kinds of stuff, and some will get rich first. There was no central banking system in China that worked. There's no central financial reality. So Deng Xiaoping decided that he was going to create an investment banking and banking wing within the People's Liberation Army. Huh? The army was now the central focus of the entire Chinese financial system? They were going to be the Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs of China? Yep. And it kind of began to work, but needless to say, generals with their hands in the big pocket of the country, the purse, somehow really got really amazing lifestyles and owned amazing companies. And by the time Deng Xiaoping had passed and it was replaced by Jiang Zemin, Jiang said, you know what? We need to get the army out of the financial system. So I'm going to create a corporation within China called CITIC. And it's going to be a civilian operation, and it will be governed by me, of course. But I'm going to try and encourage growth of private businesses and corporate structures within China within my purview. By the way, even to this day, the head of all the major corporations, the billion dollar corporations in China, have a red phone in the CEO's office. And that red phone is connected to every other red phone in every corporation. And that red phone winds up under the control of whoever's in charge of China. Oh, that would today obviously be Xi Jinping. So you have a centrally directed economy, but someone who's now encouraging business, private employment, and even ownership of stock and shares, and the country is beginning to take off. Once that economic miracle got on track, it exploded. And I remember visiting China, Shanghai, and looking across the Huangpo River and seeing Pudong, a new area. And I went across way down bridges. I went and met with the vice mayor of Pudong. And he said, look out here. What do you see? I said, I see a lot of little homes and warehouses and stuff. Within 10 years, there are going to be 88 mega buildings out there. And I'm rolling my eyes internally. I didn't want to insult the guy. And then went back. And within 10 years, there were a whole lot more than 88 buildings. There were bridges going across, tunnels going under. The entire structure, if you look at Pudong, that globe and that modern skyline is all a product of that movement. So today, China is growing. It basically grew a little bit too fast. In the last 5 or 10 years, the economy got a little overheated. You have all these residential towers and buildings all around China that are empty. They were supposed to be occupied by workers who were going to work in factories in the nearby area. It didn't kind of work that way. So China's economic structure under an autocratic leader was beginning to sputter. And it's still sputtering to this day. If you're a college graduate in China and you're looking for work, you're not looking at a lot of great prospects. And a lot of people who graduated from college have sort of dropped out of society. So now that's China today, except China has looked at the United States and said, doesn't look like much of a threat to me anymore. Thank you, Donald. I'm looking at Tulsi Gabbard. That's your DNI, Director of National Intelligence. And she's basically outing CIA people by denying their security clearance and putting it in writing so that every single CIA operative in the government is looking and saying, uh-oh, I could be hit by a Chinese hit squad for what I've done as a CIA operative. And then you've got, Pete Hegseth. Here's a guy who worked his way up to major through the reserves and others, served in Afghanistan, got a Purple Heart, but he was a major, Fox News host. And he's leading the entire Department of Defense, War. We'll talk about that in a moment, but that's not the focus of today. And here's a guy who has no military top-line experience, who has fired cadres, I use that word on purpose, of top generals and admirals, gotten rid of them entirely because they were there when woke policies, that word is simply one of the great destroyers of America, because you use the word woke for anything you don't like, and then therefore anyone knows they're supposed to hate that, even though we don't really know what woke means. But he got rid of people, and he's a dire Christian nationalist. He doesn't particularly think much of women. He doesn't think they should be able to vote except as their husband's direct. And he's purging women from top positions and from combat roles. I mean, I don't know about you, but in ancient times, maybe I didn't care if a woman had a sword, I could stab her. But a woman's flying an F-35, I'd say it's pretty much level and equal. You can pull that trigger, you can fire that missile, you can do whatever you want. Doesn't matter whether you're a man, woman, or a cat. Okay, I'm biased on cats. We'll talk about that later. Anyway, so now that he's looking at Pete, then he's looking at guys like RFK Jr., who's basically probably going to be responsible for a major rise, is already responsible for a major rise of infections and measles. We had it under control. We're getting the worst measles breakout we've had in 30 years. We're also watching an extreme growth, especially in the states from Arizona all the way over to Florida, of the latest strain of COVID, at the same time that we're restricting access to the vaccines. So, he's looking at this and saying, We're also looking at Xi saying, this guy is also charging tariffs on me, on everybody. You've got people where he's pushing them away by trying to create policy issues using tariffs as a way to control them. But what he's basically doing is alienating his allies. By the way, NATO nations have already said, you're obligated to protect Taiwan, America. We're not obligated to do anything to do with Taiwan. You do that on your own. We're worried about Europe, and if we get attacked and you're a NATO member, we are going to fight for you. But if you are aggressing or fighting somebody in Taiwan, that isn't necessarily our fight. Oh. Well, let's keep going down this road, because part of the journey is an understanding that the United States, Donald Trump, believes that he is the king of the world. He's even said that. He says, I control the world. I used to control the United States. Now I control the world. There's one little problem with that. The rest of the world doesn't actually agree with him. And maybe he can push little nations around because he doesn't really have to worry about them. But as the nations get bigger and bigger, even democracies, there's a strange thing that happens. When you attack a nation, even with an unpopular leader, what's a natural result going to be with that population? I was going to say, oh, yes, Mr. Trump, yes, sir. Want to do that right away. Yes, sir, yes, sir. How about fuck off? You can't mess with us. We're not your lackeys. We are independent nations. And your attempt to push us places we don't want to go, well, we basically are going to tell you, go screw yourself. Look at what happened. There's something that fascinated me in a bad way. A few years ago, the BRICS met together in 2009. BRICS are the following countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they gathered together as sort of non-aligned nations or non-Western nations to say, wait a minute, we don't like the economic domination of the United States. Since then, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates have joined. The BRIC nations were put together to stop America's hegemony. And remember, that was in 2009. That's when it started, and that was just those first nations. And now you take a look at the fact that the BRIC nations have a choice. Three of those, the most powerful of those BRIC nations, Brazil, India, and South Africa, that are not communist autocracies, have been effectively essential for the United States in dealing with this monolithic China that's growing like crazy. Brazil, India, South Africa. Let's take a look at what we've done to them with the tariffs and how they've reacted. We have South African President Cyril Ramaphosa basically being told that he's discriminating against white people, and his land reform, which is basically, remember, this is a country that lived with apartheid for years. It still hasn't distributed the wealth. The wealth is still primarily controlled by the white farmers with legacy wealth. So he's trying to do land reform. Trump, of course, doesn't believe that land reform, where white people lose anything, is bad. So he's opened up immigration into the United States for white people. That's kind of strange. And nobody else. And Ramaphosa is basically saying, what you doing, home? Oh, you just slapped us with a 30% tariff? What? You're not doing any more foreign aid and we need it? Hello, is this Xi? Hi, yeah, this is Cyril. Yep. I'm in South Africa. I think we should get together and, maybe we've got more in common than we think. India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is the head of state and has been the head of state, is a near autocrat, but it's still a democracy, sort of. He has been totally pro-American. He has been that representative from the other billion-plus population. By the way, India is now population-wise larger than China. He had absolutely nothing to gain by getting closer to China. Just remember, India even went to war with China in 1971. And over the years, there have been border clashes between India and China over all kinds of fun stuff. So it's not a friendly relationship. But after those tariffs, 50% tariffs to India, and all kinds of political demands by Donald Trump, because India was buying petroleum products from Russia. And Trump said, you have to do what we want you to do. You can't buy anything from Russia. He expected India to say, okay, well, yes, Mr. Trump, you're the boss. We'll do exactly as you say. But the opposite happened. The people of India, who basically said, who is this guy Trump? And how dare he challenge the billion-plus people that we have in India and tell us we have to do what he wants? Screw you, Trump. We hate you. And I'm looking at this and thinking to myself, India was our greatest ally in Asia in terms of being a really powerful country with a large population. Japan's an ally, but it's not at the order of magnitude of size as India is. And I noticed that in a recent major military parade on September 3rd, Xi Jinping had one of the largest military parades in history anywhere, one that even Donald Trump labeled as, oh, that's impressive. But guess who went? A number of people went. Obviously, the head of Iran was invited. You had a bunch of other autocrats. But the really interesting person who attended as an invitation of Xi Jinping was Modi. And you can see photographs of Modi with all the other autocrats and all the other nasty folks that are part of that orbit of China, standing there looking at the camera, and the world is looking at India and saying, well, didn't you used to be part of the other group? Didn't you used to want to stand side by side with the United States, every president that's been out there for the last few years? Weren't you considered to be the great population boost for the United States in neutralizing and containing China? What are you doing over there? And Modi said, I'm making a deal. I don't need the United States. You want to screw me over? You want to try to control my economy? I'll work out a deal with you, but you're no longer loved by us. You've alienated this country by trying to bully us. We are not bullyable. So once again, you've got now South Africa and India. Meanwhile, in Brazil, which, by the way, the idea of a trade deficit with a country doesn't apply to Brazil. They buy more stuff from us than we buy from them. There's a Brazilian president, Luis da Silva. And it's Lula da Silva. Lula basically is a liberal elected president, a reaction on the part of Brazilian voters against Jair Bolsonaro, who was trying to be a Trumpy autocrat in Brazil, who, when the election went in a different direction, where he lost the election, he decided to pull a Trumpy. He basically told the world, this election was rigged. I am the president. This guy, Lula, is not. And anyone who is faithful to me, gather around. So a lot of people started deciding that, this guy, Bolsonaro, is probably right. Let's fight. Let's go do some violent stuff and mess up the country. But unlike the United States, which gave a pardon to the people who occupied the Capitol on January 6, 2021, that didn't happen in Brazil. Lula said, you know what? We're going to let the courts and the justice system deal with this. I'm not dealing with it. But we have an independent judiciary, and if they believe that Bolsonaro's efforts to garner power by claiming a rigged election and getting people to begin violence against the state, we're going to let our judicial system deal with it. I'm not going to push that one. And indeed, Bolsonaro was indicted. He he wears ankle bracelets. He is basically someone where his people lost. And when the world looked at Donald Trump saying, my buddy, my Trumping buddy, you can't do that to him. You have to drop the trial. You have to release him. And you have to let Bolsonaro go because he was doing the right thing. He was claiming election fraud. That's perfectly okay for him. That people wanted to follow him and do things that are not particularly great on the way you look at it. That's consistent with the way the world should go. And if you don't release Bolsonaro, I'm going to sock you with a 50% tariff. Now, there are lots of things that Brazil does or makes or exports that we don't have in the United States. Ever see any cocoa plants in the United States? Coffee plantations? Okay, Kona coffee. It's a little bit, but the world's coffee, for the most part, comes from Brazil. You may have noticed of late, and I certainly have because I'm a coffee fiend, that the cost of beans everywhere is skyrocketing. Cost of chocolate is skyrocketing. And what did the Brazilian voters say? Oh no, we have to make a deal, Lula. You really, really have to go in and help us, Lula. Just accept what Donald Trump says and let's get that 50% tariff down. That's not exactly what happened. People decided that to be patriotic to Brazil was to be anti-Trump. And no, we're not going to get bullied. We're not going to let that happen. Screw you. Stop trying to run our country. We hate you. So now we're looking at country after country, big, powerful economies, looking at Donald Trump and saying, no. But what they're doing that's worse is they're looking at China and they're saying, yes. Because if we're going to be able to counter the United States, there's only one country on planet Earth that is powerful enough to make waves. What could that be? Could it be China? The People's Republic of China? So you'll start seeing lots of people sort of sauntering up to China and saying, hi, Xi, can we talk? Can I come and visit you? Oh, you're inviting me to that? Okay, I'll go. That's cool. It's not as if these countries are communist or socialist or necessarily autocratic. In fact, the European Union sat down with Xi and said, you know what? Let's make a deal. Trump is saying, no, they'll all come around. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. Clearly, they're not coming around. That's not what's happening. So we're looking at how does Xi Jinping, with his buddy, Vladimir Putin, and his other buddy, Kim Jong-un, and they're standing there, there's this lovely picture taken shortly after the parade of all these autocrats standing together, walking together, and they're basically walking together hand in hand, sneering at the United States. Putin and Xi Jinping are absolutely convinced that the United States is unraveling, that Trump is going to take the entire country down. And you may have noticed that when the President of the United States went to Anchorage to work out this lovely deal on, having a ceasefire, Putin was on former Russian soil. Yes, Alaska once belonged to Russia. Seward's Folly, we bought it for about 5 cents an acre. It was a pretty good deal. But nothing happened. Vladimir Putin didn't want a ceasefire. And you may have noticed of late that the attacks from Russia against Ukraine have escalated into oblivion. Recently, they just blew up a government building, which they never did before. And as Trump is sitting there saying, well, you know what, we can't keep, backing these guys. And if we give missiles, we'll give them to our allies, our NATO allies. And if they want to sell them to Ukraine, that's cool. That works. I have no problem with it. You just can't use those missiles for long-range targets. In other words, I can blow up all your human beings anywhere in Ukraine, and you can't use U.S. missiles, the only ones capable of reaching Moscow and other strategic targets. Okay, that's life. Well, not really. You're looking at a situation where the United States is losing political power everywhere it turns, as it has tried to tariff Europe, as it has tried to tariff, even Australia, even our allies, North and South. There's been a movement of taking U.S. policy and shoving it into the circular file, whether it's recognizing Palestine and a two-state solution, which is raging through Europe right now, or basically following economic dictates from, oh yes, Donnie. Meanwhile, you're looking at a president of the United States who's made somewhere between $4 and $5 billion of additional family wealth since he became president, primarily because he is the president. And he's done. Have you ever seen a president standing in front of a group of people trying to sell sneakers or Bibles or, watches or Bitcoins, whatever he's trying to sell? I've never seen that before, and I don't think it's good for the United States. It means we're basically a kleptocracy, which is a government where crony capitalism governs. And now when you have basic tariffs set around around the world, a number of very close major donors to Trump, campaigns, his inauguration, are asking for exemptions for the tariffs for their corporations and getting them. But now we're looking at China. China's looking at the United States. They do not believe that this country can last. They do believe that it will unravel either through a civil war or some other form of debacle. They do believe that all this class society where rich people are the winners and everyone else is the losers, which, by the way, Mr. Trump has stated repeatedly, that you can adopt taxes for the richest in the land, you can support their businesses and invest in their companies, you can get them on boards and running things and deregulating anything that made it fair for ordinary Americans. But China's looking at that saying, that doesn't strike me as being something good. We kind of realize that. So you have a bunch of idiots running government agencies. Nobody in the world has the slightest respect for most of the cabinet. People do not believe that even though the United States has the most advanced, technologically sophisticated military in the world, that it's a threat. I'll go into specifics on that in a moment, because what goes on in the military world is a fascinating look at what we face as Americans because of bad leadership. Beijing they're not stupid. You have a guy who's been running the country since 2012. He kind of has ups and downs, and right now the economy there is a little sluggish. And he needs to have his people behind him. Well, the more that the United States attacks China, just like every other country, the more the Chinese people rally behind Xi Jinping. So instead of having it erode, what's happening is the Chinese people, just like the Brazilian people, just like the Indian people, just like the South African people, are saying, screw you, Trump. And China is the only power on planet Earth that can challenge the United States at every level. Well, let's look at how they look at negotiating for tariffs. They buy Russian oil like crazy, but we try to tariff them, and meanwhile, we realize Americans buy so much Chinese stuff that the Chinese are ready to deal. And here's Beijing's playbook for trade talks. Keep talking, but don't give Trump anything important. So you have almost no progress in the negotiations on tariffs between China and the United States. So now we get to one of my most interesting topics of all. A deep dive into the military comparison between China and the United States. First of all, China is doing joint exercises with Russia. They normally don't sail their giant ships too far out of their region around China. East Yellow Sea, South China Sea, the East China Sea. They tend to stay there. But recently, they've been joining with Russian ships going up to the Arctic. Huh? What? Well, you see, there's a lot of melting ice up there, and the dream of being able to go across that area, if it were all ocean, not frozen ice, is called the Northwest Passage. And Russian icebreakers and Chinese ships are now sailing around looking at stuff, going by Alaska, winking at people. Meanwhile, China took an island in the Spratly chain in the South China Sea. It wasn't very big. So they started doing landfill around the island and built it bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they put an airfield on it. And then they claimed all the lands from the underwater passages of that area belong exclusively to China. They were baiting Vietnam. Even to this day, they're baiting the Philippines. You have people fishing in areas that are actually within what the Philippines considered their own waters. They're, watching these giant Chinese military vessel fleets, etc., sailing by. And the Chinese say, you don't understand, you're in our waters. And they're also saying that all those seas between Taiwan and China and all that area, that's ours. So United States, keep your goddamn ships out of there. Of course, what does the United States do? And I don't blame them. They're sailing their giant boats right through that area and saying, these are international waters. You, China, don't get to do this. But China is not deterred. They're still doing it. So now we're looking at the United States military. We have F-22 Raptors, we have F-35s, we have a fleet of a whole bunch of aircraft carriers. We have 7 fleets deployed all over the earth. China has 2 aircraft carriers. They have a bunch of nuclear subs, but they have missiles. And they have, even though their jet aircraft are not competitive with ours, we're leaving the world where jets matter. And what the Chinese are focusing on, and we're beginning to understand, is having massive drones. And the Chinese drones are scary. They have hypersonic missiles that travel so fast that you can't shoot them down. China's talking about having a space-oriented aircraft carrier where smaller hypersonic missiles can be launched. Russia and China are joined. North Korea is part of the party. China is aiming to go to the moon before we get back there. China has more of these modern missiles than we do. And if you watch any of the footage from the giant military parade, the 80th anniversary of World War II, that took place in Beijing on September 3rd, you have reason to be afraid, to be very afraid. Because as the United States deploys its 7 fleets around the world, China has focused all of its energy in its own region with an occasional foray with Russia to the Arctic. So that kind of means we have most of our military might somewhere else. A lot of it in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea. We have it in the Atlantic. We have it patrolling all over the place. China's got it all right there. And they absolutely have missiles with nuclear warheads that can reach any place in the United States. And if you use hypersonic missiles, you can get stuff delivered before the United States can react. So right now what you've got, and there's a wonderful review in the New York Times, just shows the military might and really breaks it down. The article was written on September 3rd by Chris Buckley and Agnes Chang, and it's absolutely terrifying to read it. And that military parade should have sent shockwaves through Mr. Trump. There's nothing he can do about it. He can't build and react. He's got the country into massive amounts of debt. The tariffs may or may not have to be refunded. And he's got a whole bunch of idiots running the entire U.S. military. Nobody of senior experience has been retained. And everybody's scared to tell the truth, because if you tell the truth and Donnie doesn't like it, you're immediately dismissed. Or if Pete Hegseth, he may have a Princeton degree, but he doesn't have the brain to go with it anymore. What he's got is me. I'm going to call it Department of War. Donald Trump is calling the Department of War. What are we fighting? War? Where's the war? Who's the enemy? Why are we declaring war on the earth? Oh, you said Chicago? You want to see what that war is all about? Interesting approach. By the way, if you change the name of the largest federal agency on planet Earth, what do you think it costs to change all the signs, the stationery, all the stuff that goes? You have to change paperwork. If we get away with spending a mere $1 billion paying for that stupid, worthless name change, we will be lucky. My guess it will be way over $1 billion. And what do we get for it? Nothing. Nothing but opprobrium. Nothing but people saying, what are you doing, Donnie? What are you trying to do? What are you worrying about? Why are you trying to scare the world by saying we're warriors again? And Trump actually said, and Pete Hegseth said, we haven't had a good military since World War II. Huh? All the guys who fought in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, et cetera, weren't. No, those were the woke military. Oh, God, I hate that word. But it hopefully will come back to haunt him. Woke is irrelevant. We have amazing military people who've served nobly in many wars. I have nothing but admiration for them. And this man is trying to denigrate what they did and their value to the country. I'm sorry, Donnie, that don't work no how for me. Those senior military officers, those officers of flag rank, admirals and generals, are for the most part highly skilled executives. Most of them have advanced degrees, PhDs, master's degrees. They are experts at warfare. They're experts at political expertise. And you want them to be the military that occupies every state in the Union that disagrees with you? That's what you want? Forget about the posse comitatus. The statute in the late 19th century said, no. The military is not to be used for domestic issues unless we're at war or there's a major insurgency, neither of which have occurred. You can't do that. Meanwhile, Hegseth is setting up police units within the military that can be used to take over cities. I'm looking at this saying no good is going to come of that. And so what you've done, Mr. Trump, is you pushed the world toward China. You pushed them away from you. You don't have the same relationships with your own allies that you used to have. They're talking to China and doing stuff you don't want. All your words have caused the local populations of those countries to say, screw the United States. And we've never been weaker since World War II. This is the weakest period of our lifetime. And we're looking at the world rebelling against us. And we will be the biggest losers. I hate to end on that note, but hang on there, folks. Hopefully some sense will come of this. Americans will realize what's going on. And that's my story for today. We'll wait for the next podcast. Thank you for listening.
If you would like to give feedback, suggestions for new topics, or have a question that might be selected for a future podcast, please email us at dekompodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. Until next time.